So let's begin here. You have facsimile 1, and for anybody who's spent time as maybe a child or a youth in a longer than expected sacrament meeting, and you start scrolling through the scriptures, there aren't very many pictures in these books, but the book of Abraham has 3 of them where you've maybe spent some time looking at these pictures. And as we begin with facsimile 1, help us, orient us here, Kerry. What should we know?
Well, I think, to understand facsimile 1, we probably have to start even before that with the first couple of verses of chapter 1, because those first few verses are what set up the story that we have in facsimile 1. And really, this is where Abraham gets tied into Adam, right? This is where all of it is tied together, because Abraham is really explicit that he is searching for something. He talks about fathers, and that's not his immediate father, but his ancestors. And he wants to find what they've had, despite the fact that his immediate father has turned away from God. But Abraham is aware from writings he's received, and I presume these are some of the writings that was talked about in the book of Moses, but from writings he's received, he has become aware of a covenant, right? And he speaks of it in verse 2, saying, finding there was greater happiness and peace and rest for me, I sought for the blessings of the fathers and the right whereunto I should be ordained to administer the same. So he wants to hold the priesthood for the right reason. He wants to be able to help other people receive these blessings. And what kind of blessings do you receive through the priesthood? It's covenant blessings, right? So if we look at verses 3 and 4 especially, Abraham is really specific that the blessings or the covenant he's seeking for is the one that Adam had. You get at the end of verse 3 that he gets these, even the right of the firstborn or the first man who is Adam, or the first father through the fathers unto me. So this covenant that Abraham receives and follows, which ends up in the story that's in facsimile 1, is the covenant that Adam had, and it's just being renewed with Abraham. It's beautiful stuff.
That is beautiful. If you look closely at verse 2, notice the descriptive words that are being used to describe what Abraham's desires are. Look at this. And finding there was greater happiness and peace and rest for me, I sought for. Notice he's not sitting back waiting for something big to happen. Right. He's actively seeking for the blessings of the fathers and the right whereunto I should be ordained to administer the same. He's going into it actually expecting not just to answer a curiosity question, but he's expecting to put his agency on the line for the Lord to say, look, I want these blessings, and I know it's going to take effort for me once I have them to be able to administer the same and to bless other people with them. Then he goes on, having been myself a follower of righteousness. So once again, he's not sowing seeds of doubt and seeds of wickedness, expecting to harvest fruits of righteousness. He's been a follower of righteousness. His life is one of, in the face of, as Kerry said, adversity with his own immediate family and father. He's been a worker of righteousness against all odds. And then notice this word, desiring also to be one who possessed great knowledge and to be a greater follower of righteousness. So he's already a follower of righteousness, but he wants to be a greater follower of righteousness. It's this line upon line, what some have called divine discontent. This idea that I'm trying, but I want to be better. And you sense that from these words coming from Abraham here.
And it's not just, as you said, not a greater, it is a greater follower of righteousness, but also possessing greater knowledge, right? So this idea, he doesn't plateau out. Everyone's going to plateau at some time, yeah. But he's not satisfied on that plateau. As you said, he's got some discontent with that. He's going to keep pursuing that. And
desiring to receive instructions and to keep the commandments of God, I became a rightful heir of the high priest. So you're seeing this pattern. Recently, at a devotional with Elder Neil L. Anderson, Elder Anderson had asked Bradley Wilcox to go around and interview people and ask them how they make time for the Lord, because President Nelson has pled with us to make time for the Lord every day. I thought it was fascinating. One of those people that he interviewed happened to be President Kevin J. Worthen, the president of BYU. And what he said really struck me as tying in beautifully with what is going on here in chapter 1, verse 2. He said that when he wakes up in the morning, he never checks his phone for social media, for emails, for texts, for any outside communication. He says, I'll take care of all that later. First, he studies from the scriptures, and I think specifically he mentioned from the Book of Mormon. He wants to establish that connection with God first. Then he's going to deal with all of the other problems and other communications that are going to come his way. Now, that's not to say that everybody has to do exactly what President Worthen does. It's the idea that we find ways to do exactly what Abraham has talked about here, so that this week's Come Follow Me lesson isn't just about going, hey, that's really cool for Abraham. Look how neat that is that he did that. The idea is, so what could I do to actually turn this into part of my story as well, to tie into that legacy? If we want to be sons and daughters of this faithful couple, Abraham and Sarah, from the past, then we probably ought to figure out more of how we can do the works of Abraham and Sarah in our day today.
Excellent. And maybe we can just take that and touch on one little line that I think is so important here at the end of verse 2, where he says, and you read it, but it says he's desiring to receive instructions. Right? And most people I know aren't looking like, please tell me more things that I should do. But in fact, that's what we should be doing, right? That's what I think President Nelson has told us to do, both when he said, you're not going to survive without personal inspiration or with revelation from the Holy Ghost regularly, when he said, make time for God, which is what Elder Anderson and President Worthen were talking about there. We should be. It's actually good for us in our lives if God is giving us instructions. It gives us more opportunity for happiness and joy and progression and everything else. But it's this key. We see in Abraham that he wants more righteousness, more knowledge, more instructions. Just tell me what to do, God, and I'll go do it, is what we kind of get from Abraham.
I love that. I love that. Now, with scriptures, you'll notice that they'll often put the opposites juxtaposed right next to each other. So we've just introduced Abraham's great desires for righteousness and for knowledge and more revelation and more power and priesthood and capacity to bless the world. That's in verse 1 through 4. And then notice the contrast. Verse 5, my fathers, having turned from their righteousness and from the holy commandments which the Lord their God had given unto them, unto the worshiping of gods of the heathen, utterly refused to hearken to my voice. So you get this polar opposite right there on page 1. And welcome to the world of agency, right? Nobody is sitting in your front room forcing you to love God or forcing you to seek His will. This is your choice. And this verse 5 is also available to us to choose. But it never ends well. Look at verse 6. For their hearts were set to do evil and were wholly turned to the God of Elkanah and the God of Libnah and the God of Mamachrah and the God of Korash, and the God of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So they turned their hearts to the sacrifice of the heathen. There's a beautiful story. We don't know if it's true. It's a rabbinical tradition among the Jewish rabbis from antiquity. It's found in a non-canonical, non-scriptural source.
And kind of late.
And it's late, so we don't know if it's true. But the principle, I think, is instructive to us. It's about young Abraham working in his father's idol shop. Terah is his father, who, in this telling of this story, owns an idol shop. What does he do one day that Terah's gone? And
yeah, this is part of his efforts, because you saw how he said there that they refused to hearken to his voice, which tells us, he doesn't say it explicitly, but it tells us he's been trying to teach them. He's been trying to preach against idolatry. And so one of the key elements here is that Abraham, knowing that this could go wrong because no one's listening to him and people are pretty set in their idolatry, as he mentions in verse 6 and 7, he's still going to try and teach them, and what he just talking to them hasn't worked. So he, at least in this story, he goes into where they have all of the idols, and he breaks them all down except for one. And if I remember right, he leaves the little stick right there by that one.
By the biggest idol, he's got the stick.
And then everyone comes in and they say, what happened? All of these were broken. What happened to these? And Abraham says, oh, that guy did it, right? And he's pointed at the one idol that's left. He did it. He did it.
He must be jealous of all these others, so he finished them off.
Yeah. And they say to him, that's ridiculous. You had to have done this. He can't have done this. And Abraham says, well, then why are you worshiping him, right? It's this great way of, and I don't know if it's true or not, but I love the story because it's this great way of Abraham trying to show them the foolishness of worshiping idols. And we have to keep in mind, since we do want to relate this to ourselves, that we may not have idols of stone, but we have equally silly idols that seem so important to us. And our task is to identify what those might be in our lives. But I love the story, and whether it's happened that way or not, there are tons of ancient traditions about Abraham preaching against idolatry in one form or another, and that's what ends up in facsimile 1, right? What's depicted in facsimile 1.
Right. So which actually brings us back to the very first verse, just for a second before we turn the page over. I don't believe that Abraham intended for verse 1 to be humorous, but in my mind, it's one of the funniest verses in all of Scripture in its context of facsimile 1, when he opens and says, in the land of the Chaldeans, or do you pronounce that Chaldeans?
Either way is good.
Either way is good. Yeah. At the residence of my fathers, I, Abraham, saw that it was needful for me to obtain another place of residence. Living here is not healthy for me. It's not great for my life.
Yeah, it might be good to live when everyone here is trying to kill me. I'm just saying. That's basically verse 1, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So now they're describing in verse 7 that their hearts have been turned to the sacrifice of the heathen in offering up their children unto these dumb idols, and hearken not unto my voice.
Well, while we're talking about that and the importance of fathers for Abraham, I think Abraham becomes kind of the prototypical story of someone who comes from a less than ideal family background. His father is not the kind of father that we would all hope for, right? He's trying to kill him, for one thing. And so he turns to his heavenly Father. It doesn't matter what kind of family background we come from. If we focus on our heavenly Father, then we have the Father that can do for us what we need to do.
Amen.
That is profound for people who have less than ideal family situations today. So now, as we jump into verse 8, now at this time, it was the custom of the priests of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, to offer up upon the altar which was built in the land of Chaldea for the offering unto these strange gods, men, women, and children. So isn't it fascinating how the devil takes things that God has established, in this case sacrifice, where Adam and Eve were taught to sacrifice animals to the Lord. And then the devil has a counterfeit, where there are a lot of similar elements here, but he has twisted it to one of the most evil practices in the history of the world. So Abraham's right there in the middle of this practice going on. Look at verse 11. Now the priests had offered up on this altar 3 virgins at one time who were the daughters of Onidah, one of the royal descent directly from the loins of Ham. Why? Why did these 3 daughters lose their life? Because of their virtue. They would not bow down to worship gods of wood or of stone. Therefore, they were killed upon this altar, and it was done after the manner of the Egyptians.
In fact, I think if we look at this, I can't read God's mind to know why does he deliver Abraham and not deliver these 3 fair virgins that are so full of virtue. But I think we can think of at least a couple things. One, there's clearly a work left for Abraham to do. Abraham has to do something. And my guess, that's why he's delivered. And maybe before we move to other things, maybe I can just touch on a couple of historical, cultural elements of this sacrifice story. Because what you get here is it presents the picture of a mixing of Canaanite and Egyptian religious practices. And that's really interesting. And we can actually kind of plot out where are the places where the Egyptians did actively try and control some areas because they were key for trade routes and military routes and things like that. And so we're going to guess that Abraham is in one of those areas. There are nearby areas that they just completely left alone because it didn't matter economically and from a strategic point of view for them. So we can kind of guess where Abraham is, but we also have to think, okay, it talks about they sacrificed them. It says specifically after the manner of the Egyptians. But what does that mean? Does it mean the Egyptians were often offering children? Probably not. And in fact, I've studied this a lot. I do think that the story we see here fits with Egyptian practice very well. We see that the Egyptians did sacrifice people when those people were disturbing the correct religious order and preaching against the worship of Egyptian gods and knocking down gods. That would certainly do that, right? And there was a specific way they would do it on an altar, and you can use a knife, and it's a flint knife. They look a lot like what's pictured in this facsimile, and that kind of a thing. And then they would burn them. And in a lot of the traditions, they say they were going to burn Abraham, and this one talks about using a knife. And I think that both are probably correct. You use a knife like you do with an animal. You kill it, and then you burn it. But the idea of child and children, that's probably more of a Canaanite practice. And we do know that happens from the Bible. We know that happens from some of the local culture around there. And that's what I think you're getting here is this mixing of culture, which is exactly what the text describes, is you get those two cultures mixing together, and when they mix together, it perfectly creates the scenario that we see happening in this story. It just fits with that time period and with what we know of their practices from that time period.
Very helpful. Thank you. So let's jump into verse 12. It came to pass that the priests laid violence upon me, that they might slay me also, as they did these virgins upon this altar. And that you may have a knowledge of this altar, I will refer you to the representation at the commencement of this record. So he's referring us back to facsimile 1, saying, now I'm going to tell you the story of that picture. Again, we don't know if that story of him destroying the other idols in his father's idol shop is actual, if it's factual. But if it were, that would be a case that would cause Terah, the idol worshiper, to say, okay, that's a capital offense, what you just did, and deliver him over to the priests.
Yeah, it's disturbed that religious order so much that the only response is a ritual response.
Yep, right. We're gonna sacrifice you on this altar. So verse 13, it was made after the form of a bedstead, such as was had among the Chaldeans, and it stood before the gods of Elkanah, Libnah, Mamachrah, Korash, and also a god like unto that of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And then he tells you, just so you can see a representation of these gods, I've given you the fashion and the figures in that facsimile. Is there anything that we should know about those representations of the gods?
Sure. I mean, there are plenty of things we could talk about. The way it's drawn here, and we have to recognize we don't know was there a drawing originally? Did Abraham make a drawing? If so, was it like this? Or is this someone else who takes a drawing that Abraham had and they draw it the way they're used to drawing in an Egyptian style? Or we don't know exactly how this particular form or style gets introduced. But the way it's drawn, these are figures that we would identify typically as the four sons of Horus and the canopic jars that would often go under an altar like that. But what seems to be happening here is that those Egyptian gods are being, and the technical term we use, are being syncretized. And this is when, and it's a really, really common practice in the ancient world, that you have a god that represents one thing and you meet another culture that has a god that's somewhat similar and you mesh them together. And you say, okay, well, these two gods are kind of the same thing, so we'll call them by these different names. So those names actually seem to be Canaanite names. And we can identify at least, well, all four of them in at least some way, and we've got really good evidence for a couple of them. So Elkanah, for example. But so my guess is, and we don't really know, but my guess is that what we have depicted here is a kind of a meshing together or a syncretization, that's the technical term for this kind of thing that happens all the time, of Canaanite and Egyptian gods, or just an assigning of Canaanite gods to a typical Egyptian figure, which we also know happened all the time.
So Kerry, let's orient people just to make sure we're on the same page here. Mm-hmm. Because we know what we mean when we're using terms like Egyptian and Canaanite, but not everybody always does. And sometimes it makes scripture study confusing and frustrating, and we feel like we're not getting it. So a really simple description is you have Egypt, which at the time is it is a dynastic power in their known world.
Yeah. So and this would be the Mediterranean Sea.
Mediterranean Sea there. Here, just to orient you, there is where we would put Jerusalem today, close to the Dead Sea. There's the Jordan River and the Sea of Galilee. Anciently, That's when he keeps using this term Canaanite. We're talking about that region.
Now, there's some argument as to exactly where Abraham and this that he's in the land of the Chaldeans is. Some people would place it in Mesopotamia, which would be like way over here in modern-day Iraq. But based on the evidence from this, and there's people who even without the book of Abraham have proposed this, but based on this evidence of the Egyptian synchronization that's going on here, it's quite likely that it's kind of up here on the border between Syria and Turkey. Which Canaanite is a kind of a weird term. It's what we apply to all sorts of older people that we don't know exactly what they worshiped.
Where do
and what
they
they
fit
did.
them in?
It's not really a uniform culture, but there are some uniform elements. So this is kind of Canaan proper, but we still often use this term for this whole area. And so it's quite likely that Abraham, and we have some different kinds of evidence. We can bring in archaeological, textual, and scriptural evidence to deduce this. But I suspect that this is probably the area that it's happening in, and it's got a lot of this kind of Canaanite or Semitic religious influence and Egyptian influence.
So now, verse 15 says, "And as they lifted up their hands upon me, that they might offer me up and take away my life, behold, I lifted up my voice unto the Lord my God." Let me pause there. Look back at the facsimile. Again, as Kerry said, we don't have Abraham's actual first autograph version of facsimile number 1. So is this a copy of a copy of a copy times 10 or times 2? Or is it somebody taking something else that he had produced? And we just don't know. But what we do have, what God has given us, it has some pretty interesting features. And I'm no Egyptologist, but I spent some time as a kid in sacrament meeting studying this. And some things that stick out to me that are fascinating are, if I am on an altar and some guy is coming towards me with a knife, I can almost guarantee where my eye is going to be. It's going to be on that knife. And you're going to notice where Abraham's eyes are in this particular version of facsimile 1. He's not even looking at the guy, nor the knife. He's not looking at his problem or his potential problem. He's looking heavenward. He's looking to the solution. He's looking to God. And you'll notice where his hands are. His hands aren't trying to defend himself against this guy. His hands in this depiction are in a attitude of pleading.
Yeah, it's a supplication gesture
to God. I like that, because you and I all have in our own ways these struggles, these trials, these oppositions of the world coming at us, and it would be easy to focus only on those problems, which would probably lead to greater anxiety and stress and panic, whereas this facsimile, to me, teaches a lesson all by itself, just in the way it's depicted, to say, look to God and live. So the Lord hearkened and heard, and he filled me with the vision of the Almighty, and the angel of his presence stood by me and immediately unloosed my bands. It's beautiful, this redemptive story, an atonement object lesson, a redemption story, yet again, saved from death and delivered from that death by God, and our bands are loosed. It's powerful. And then, what does he hear? Verse 16, his voice was unto me, Abraham, Abraham, behold, my name is Jehovah. Now, do we have an earlier account of him hearing the name change from Abram, which is what Terah called him, right, to Abraham?
No, so, and in fact, if you look at the earliest manuscripts that we have, where Joseph scribes are copying down the book of Abraham, it's originally Abram here, Avram in Hebrew. So yeah, it's as they were editing it, they later changed this to Abraham, I assume, to make it so that people just understood who we were talking about here. But this is before his experience of having his name changed. And that's the way it read originally, and then it was edited at some point to read Abraham.
Good. So word meanings. Abram, exalted father. Abraham,
father of multitudes, which is bound up in the covenant God makes to Abraham, that He'll be a father of many nations, which fulfills his desire, Abraham's desire, to be a father of many nations. And by consequence, all of us as children of Abraham, we all get access to those same promises.
And the kind of staking out of names is an important part of the covenant making process in ancient covenants between nations and certainly in the scriptures. And so I suspect we have that starting here because we get God stating his name very clearly, right? My name is Jehovah and I have heard thee. That sounds like the beginning of a covenant making process to me. And so I suspect this is where it begins, because also the next thing he says is, I'm going to take you away from here to a strange land. Well, that's one of the main parts of the covenant, is I'm going to give you this other land. And so I think we have the beginning of the covenant making process that we'll look at. It happens more and more fully, I think, as we read today's reading. We see Abraham enter into it. A lot of people have argued, well, so why is he entering into the covenant? Like, is it this one was a precursor and the next one he's kind of telling him about it, and the last one he finally gets into the covenant? Or are these different traditions? And people ask all these questions. But I think we enter into the covenant in stages, right? We do. We enter into it at baptism, but we enter into it more fully in the temple, and more fully as we're sealed in the temple at spouse and so on. So we enter into the covenant in stages, and I think we see not necessarily a precise mirror of that, but an echo-ish kind of mirror of it in the Abraham story.
That's beautiful. If you jump down to verse 18, notice he takes that idea, exactly what you just described. Behold, I will lead thee by my hand. The leading by the hand denotes a journey. It denotes a process. It denotes a passage of time, not I'm going to do this in an instant and then leave you alone because you've got everything you need. I'm going to lead you by the hand, and I will take thee to put upon thee my name, even the priesthood of thy father, and my power shall be over thee. Did you notice that? God gave him his name in verse 16. Very clearly, my name is Jehovah. But I'm going to put my name upon you, Abraham. You're going to have my name put upon you. And from that point on, Abraham and later on Sarah, those two become the father and mother of all the faithful. If you're saved, you find salvation by being adopted into their faithful family. And when you get adopted in, you take upon you the family name. Well, what's the family name? It's the name of God that he has placed upon them.
And we do that through because we enter into the same covenant, we very much focus on taking the name of Jehovah or Christ upon us.
So as we turn over to now starting the story in verse 20 through the end, you're going to get a lot of description here about Pharaoh, the original Pharaoh, and Egypt, and Ham, and Egyptus, and the patriarchal line coming down through that family. We're not going to spend a ton of time on that. You'll notice that in verse 27 it says, Now Pharaoh, being of that lineage by which he should not have the right of priesthood, notwithstanding the Pharaohs would fain claim it from Noah through Ham. Therefore my father was led away by their idolatry. Which brings us back to something Taylor talked about earlier, where you take those ideas, those covenants, those priesthood ordinances that had been given anciently, and they've modified them and owned them for their own purposes. And we come down to verse 30. It talks about this famine prevailing. So we're going to watch wherever he is, wherever really is, they're going to start making a transition over towards Egypt. So he's going to leave here, comes down into here, into this new land, because the famine is so bad. And then from there, it's going to bring us all the way down into Egypt. Turn the page over to chapter 2, which is where it's describing this journey, starting in verse 1. And then verse 2 describes we're introduced to some additional characters in the family. It came to pass that I, Abraham, took Sarai to wife, and Nahor, my brother, took Milcah to wife, who was the daughter of Haran. Haran is the third brother of Abraham. So you're going to find that now that the narrative slows down a little bit and starts fleshing things out, you're going to get more detail about some of the relationships, as we just saw in verse 2, with Nahor marrying Milcah, who's the daughter of Haran, his brother, so this would be his niece. How do these family relationships work in the way we label them in antiquity, because in English we have all kinds of words to show various familial relationships, but not always the case in antiquity.
Yeah, so it gets a little bit confusing because we'll get someone who's said to be a mother or a daughter or a sister, but there aren't words and we don't know exactly what Abraham is speaking, but in any of the languages that are potential things he's speaking, there's not a word for aunt or niece and so on. And so you just say if it's an older female relative, it's mother, and this works for men as well. Older male relative, it's a father. If it's someone of the same generation, so cousins, second cousins, third cousin, twice removed, that's a sister or a brother. And younger generations, nephews and nieces, whatever else, those would be children or sons or daughters. And so when we talk about Sarah being his sister, there's some sources that make it seem like she really is his half-sister, but it's not, we can't nail it down really precisely, but she's some kind of close relative along that same generational line, that kind of horizontal line, so she would be correctly referred to as sister. It's the only word you can use to describe her.
So as you work your way down that first column, verse 4 tells you that he left the land of Ur to go into the land of Canaan. And then verse 5, the famine abated, and my father tarried in Haran and dwelt there, as there were many flocks in Haran. And my father turned again unto his idolatry, therefore he continued in Haran.
More heartbreak for Abraham, right?
I just think it's kind of the Book of Mormon pride cycle going on here in this family of Abraham. That idea of, boy, it's a famine, we're going to die, everybody gets humble, turns to God, please deliver us, and that humility, that repentance, God does deliver, and now we're prospering again. Okay, now we can get back to the way things used to be, and back to the idol worship goes Terah.
And forget about God, right?
And forget about God, because I don't need him anymore, because I've got food in my belly again, and the rains are coming, and we're good.
And maybe we can use that as a segue to the next topic of this chapter, because we often talk about the pride cycle, and that phrase is ingrained in members of the church like we couldn't believe. But I think there's actually a better, more descriptive term, because it's not just the pride cycle, it's a covenant or a covenant corruption cycle, right? Because everything you just talked about happens in terms of the covenant. When you keep the covenant, you get the blessings, and then you think it's because you're great, and so you stop keeping the covenant. It's the same cycle, but it's always connected to the covenant. And that's exactly what we're seeing here, is that Abraham was keeping the covenant, his father had stopped, started again, stops again. Abraham's going to stay consistent. He doesn't go through the cycle. He doesn't get to the corruption part of the covenant corruption cycle. He just stays in the covenant. And that's which has started to be established, but we're going to see it established more fully as the next thing in this chapter.
So to verify that, look at verse 6. But I, Abraham, and Lot, my brother's son, prayed unto the Lord, and the Lord appeared unto me. So they're prospering now. It would have been easy to say, eat, drink, and be merry, we're good. But he continued to turn to the Lord, prayed to the Lord, and the Lord appeared unto me and said unto me, Arise, and take Lot with thee, for I have purposed to take thee away out of Haran, and to make thee a minister to bear my name in a strange land, which I will give unto thy seed after thee for an everlasting possession, when they hearken to my voice. Did you notice that? When? It's a condition. It's not a guarantee. There's nothing you need to do. I'm just going to force this on you, whether you want it or not. It's, no, when they hearken to my voice, I'm going to promise this land to them.
Yeah, and let's say verse 7 and 8 is, again, we see this covenant. I guess we could call it the kind of trappings of the covenant, where he says, again, identifying himself, I am the Lord thy God, and identifying who he is. I dwell in the heavens, and the earth is my footstool. I stretch out my hand over the sea. And so he tells him he's the one who creates and controls creation. We get down to verse 8. My name is Jehovah, and I know the end from the beginning. Therefore, my hand shall be over thee. Right now, starting in verse 9, he's going to really start to get in specifics of the covenant, but always the first element is establishing who you are, establishing who I am, our relationships. I am God, the creator. You're Abraham. I'm going to help you out, but let's be clear who we are. And now we're going to get into the specifics of the covenant.
So now these are the promises that God is offering to Abraham, and we may be amazed at what God says, But I want all of us to pause and remember that these promises are also ours. That's why we focus so much on the Abraham and Sarah story, is that what God is offering them, by extension, all of us have access to the same blessings. And here's these beautiful promises. I will make of thee a great nation. I will bless thee above measure and make thy name great among all nations. I'm going to pause there. We talked in the last lesson about how the people of the Tower of Babel, they wanted to make their own name great. And in society today, we see people wanting to make their names great. And what we learn in the Abraham story is that that is God's work. It is God's work to make our name great. And it becomes great because we actually take his name upon us. And thou shalt be a blessing unto thy seed after thee, and that in their hands they shall bear the ministry and priesthood unto all nations. And I will bless them through thy name, for as many as receive this gospel shall be called after thy name, and shall be accounted thy seed, and shall rise up and bless thee as father.
And notice how we get this kind of extension of names going on, right? So I'm God, and you're going to take my name upon you. But because you're doing that, Abraham, and you're becoming like me, then other people are going to be involved with your name, right? And we get this. This is very similar to what God does, the Father does with Christ, right? He sends his Son. His Son comes down to send others. Those others bring people to Christ, and he brings them to the Father. And that's the exact pattern that we're seeing here.
That's a cool connection.
That's amazing. And isn't it neat to notice that God could have prevented the famine? God could have made it so that Abraham and Terah and Lot and everybody could have just stayed prospering up in Ur, but the famine caused some movement. They come down to Canaan, and the famine keeps going, and they're going to move into Egypt. So what you get with Abraham and Sarah's story is this little microcosm back then of what God is doing with his covenantal promises today. He's spreading it among the nations. He's spreading it among different peoples rather than keeping it insular of don't let anyone in and don't you dare go out and interact with and talk with anybody. Abraham and Sarah's story is a perfect example of what happens when God scatters the people. It's not just the people, it's also this message, the scriptures, the connection with God. And that name.
And I think, again, just my opinion, but I think this, what we're reading right now in the next verse, is one of the biggest reasons that the book of Abraham was restored to Joseph Smith. Because if you study the covenant and the way that we have it in Genesis and the way we have it in the book of Abraham is very similar, except for one thing. There is one element that is completely missing in the Genesis account that is a really big deal in the account the way we get it in the book of Abraham. And it's this idea that they will bear the ministry and the priesthood that we had in verse 9 or in verse 11. After this first part, very typical of what we see in Genesis, I will bless them that bless thee and curse them that curse thee. But listen to this. And in thee, that is in thy priesthood, and in thy seed, that is in thy priesthood. For I give unto thee a promise that this right shall continue in thee and in thy seed after thee. And so on. But then he says, even with the blessings of the gospel, which are the blessings of salvation, even of life eternal. And so there's this obligation. If we read the book of Abraham account, one of the main obligations of the Abrahamic covenant that we're all part of is to share that covenant with others by administering priesthood ordinances to them that make that covenant available, right? That is a huge part of this. You do not find that in the Genesis account. I think if you read First Nephi, Nephi's vision, and it talks about, before it talks about plain and precious truths being taken out, it says that the covenants are taken out. And I think this is the part of the covenant that Satan wanted out the most. If you get this part out, it doesn't matter. Okay, we got a few small group of people that have the covenant, no one else, Satan wins, all right? But if this part is restored as it was, that part of the obligation of the covenant is to give the covenant to everyone, to all the world, now we're doing God's work.
Yeah, that part right there, that little phrase, shall all the families of the earth be blessed. That this covenant wasn't intended to be exclusive to that one group. It's to bless everybody. That is one of the most oft-repeated concepts in Scripture. You find it in the Old Testament, you find it in the New Testament, you find it in the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, the Pearl of Great Price, repeatedly, is that God isn't just giving us those blessings so that we enjoy them in isolation. In fact, if we want to be more Christ-like, the greatest joy comes in turning outward and sharing all the good things that God has given us with as many people as we can. Hence, our zeal for missionary work and our zeal for sharing and teaching and never tiring of giving those things that heaven has given to us.
And temple work as well. It's the same thing, right?
Both sides of the veil.
That's right. Yeah,
Both
we want you
sides of
dead
the
or
veil.
alive. Yep.
Now, verse 12, after the Lord had withdrawn from speaking to me and withdrawn his face from me, I said in my heart, thy servant has sought thee earnestly. Now I have found thee.
I love that verse.
Yeah.
I love how that ends. Because you see that tie-in to those first verses in Abraham 1, where he was just so deeply desirous, and he's had all this trauma and difficulty, and now he's like, God has saved me. This deep desire I've had has now been fulfilled.
And again, it's tied into the covenant. What he says in those first few verses, I want those blessings in that covenant. And once he gets to covenant, he says, I found thee. This is how we find God, is through his covenant.
And then notice, he doesn't stop there and say, I've arrived. Now I can relax on the covenant path. Verse 13, thou didst send thine angel to deliver me from the gods of Elkanah, and I will do well to hearken unto thy voice. There's something beautifully Christ-like about that. You'll notice the pattern even with the Savior, Jesus Christ himself. When he came to the Nephites in 3 Nephi 11, here he is. He's a resurrected, glorified, perfected being. He's a God. He's arrived. He's finished. And when he comes to those Nephites, when he gets into chapters 15 and 16 of 3 Nephi, he tells them, I need to deliver a message to you that I was commanded of the Father to give to you, and I'm going to fulfill that commandment. Here he is, a resurrected God, and what is he still doing? Keeping commandments given to him by God the Father. I think there's a beautiful pattern for us, that Jesus and Abraham are both showing us in different spheres that obedience to God's commandments is not a chore. It's not distasteful. It's not fine. If I have to, I'll do it. It's a please tell me, what can I do better, and let me joyfully try to figure out how to make that happen in my life.
Yeah. Desiring to receive more instruction, right?
And it just never ends. So verse 15 is where he takes Sarai to wife. You'll notice Sarai, her name is going to get changed to Sarah. Abram changed to Abraham. So they both begin with one name, and then they become something else. A new name is given to them as they move forward as the father and the mother of the faithful.
And that's, again, indicative of covenant. As you make a covenant, you become a new person, you take on a new life, and so you get a new name to represent the new person as you're reborn or born again.
Yeah, like in baptism, you take on a new name. You take on the name of Christ. So we see this in the Bible, that there's these transition stages in people's lives. When they make covenants, they are given a new name, and it's often a signal that they are now in a new covenantal relationship. And we have the same in our lives.
So the rest of this chapter, this new couple, Abraham and Sarah, he describes verse 16, eternity was our covering, and our rock and our salvation, as we journeyed from Haran by the way of Jershon to come to the land of Canaan. And he built an altar, offered sacrifice, and verse 19, the Lord appeared unto me in answer to my prayers and said unto me, unto thy seed will I give this land. So he's in that more traditional, what we would call the land of Israel, the Holy Land, land of Canaan. And God promised him, I'm going to give you and your seed this land. And then he built another altar, called again upon the name of the Lord, and then he journeys down into Egypt in chapter 22, or verse 22.
I'm going to jump in here. What's interesting is he keeps building altars. One time he says, it's to ask the Lord devoutly, will you please remove the famine? Now remember, God promised, I'm going to give you land. Now, this is kind of a challenge. Like, would you want to worship a God who said, I'm going to give you land, and you get there, and it's a famine? Wait, did God lie to you? And so Abraham has to find himself all the way down in Egypt to get away from the famine. And it's not like, well, God hasn't answered his prayers yet. So you might say Abraham could just be unfaithful and say, I'm not believing anymore. He also has promised a lot of seed, children. And what happens in Egypt? Sarah gets taken. So it's really interesting. Immediately, God actually puts Abraham to the test to see if Abraham will trust that God's promises are sure. These very clear promises. You're going to have land, you're going to have posterity. Oops, you don't get either of those right now. And Abraham persists and endures. And the way the story unfolds is that Abraham shows trust and faith in God, and he gets all those things back. So I just think it's compelling that even in our own lives, we may pray to God, we may place things on the altar, we want something. We're pleading with him to give us something he's promised. We have to endure to the end. We have to be faithful like Abraham and Sarah to give God the time to work out his salvation in our lives.
And it seems, honestly, if you look at his whole story now as we jump into Genesis chapter 12, everything that we've covered from Abraham chapters 1 and 2, and now as we proceed forward, I can't find a time in Abraham's life where he has this long period of, oh, finally, okay, things are, there's no testing going on. God's just prospering everything, and it's just smooth, flowing, easy, clear waters for him. It seems that his and Sarah's life in its entirety is one of test after test after test. And gratefully, we call them the father and mother of all the faithful, because he just seems to find a way to stay faithful.
And I think we sometimes underestimate how much is asked of him, right? He's going from an urban lifestyle to becoming a nomad for the rest of his life. He's going to be in a land that it will eventually be given to him and his seed, but God actually tells him it's going to be 400 years, just so you know. And so he's living where other people feel like they control, and he always has to be careful of that, moving from place to place to place continually. I mean, it is never easy, and as we've said, never seen it for a long time. How are these prayers and these blessings going to be answered? Nothing about Abraham's life is easy at any point. And
then while he's in Egypt, you'll notice back in your book of Abraham, facsimile number 3, he describes that as Abraham sitting on Pharaoh's throne, teaching the people about the cosmos, about eternity, about God, teaching the gospel, which is what that Abrahamic covenant was intended to do. Go, teach, share this knowledge.
In fact, in the book of Abraham, and in Come Follow Me, we've already covered chapter 3, but you go from chapter 2, where the covenant is really outlined and established, to chapter 3, where he says specifically, I'm sending you to Egypt. Here's what you're going to teach them. Use astronomy to teach them these principles. And then we don't get the account of his doing it. We just get the picture that tells us that he's doing it. The account was probably in the book of Abraham. We don't have the whole thing. But all we get is that drawing that says he did it.
That's right.